There was a brief period during which Father Brown enjoyed, or rather did not enjoy, something like fame. He was a 9 days wonder in the newspapers. He was even a common topic of controversy in the weekly reviews. His exploits were narrated eagerly and inaccurately in any number of clubs and drawing rooms, especially in America. Incongruous and indeed incredible as it may seem to anyone who knew him, his adventures as a detective were even made the subject of short stories appearing in magazines. Strangely enough, this wandering limelight struck him in the most obscure, or at least the most remote, of his many places of residence. He had been sent out to officiate as something between a missionary and a parish priest in one of those sections of the northern coast of South America, where strips of country still cling insecurely to European powers, or are continually threatening to become independent republics under the gigantic shadow of President Monroe. The population was red and brown with pink spots. That is, it was Spanish American and largely Spanish American Indian, but there was a considerable and increasing infiltration of Americans of the northern sort, Englishmen, Germans, and the rest, and the trouble seems to have begun when one of these visitors, very recently landed and very much annoyed at having lost one of his bags, approached the first building of which he came in sight, which happened to be the mission house and chapel attached to it, in front of which ran a long veranda and a long row of stakes, up which were trained the black twisted vines, their square leaves red with autumn. Behind them, also in a row, a number of human beings sat almost as rigid as the stakes and colored in some fashion like the vines. For while their broad-brimmed hats were as black as their unblinking eyes, the complexions of many of them might have been made out of the dark red timber of those transatlantic forests. Many of them were smoking very long, thin, black cigars, and in all that group the smoke was almost the only moving thing. The visitor would probably have described them as natives, though some of them were very proud of Spanish blood. But he was not one to draw any fine distinction between Spaniards and Red Indians, being rather disposed to dismiss people from the scene when once he had convicted them of being native to it. He was a newspaper man from Kansas City, a lean, light-haired man with what Meredith called an adventurous nose. One could almost fancy it found its way by feeling its way and moved like the proboscis of an anteater. His name was Snaith, and his parents, after some obscure meditation, had called him Saul, a fact which he had the good feeling to conceal as far as possible. Indeed, he had ultimately compromised by calling himself Paul, though by no means for the same reason that had affected the apostle of the Gentiles. On the contrary, so far as he had any views on such things, the name of the persecutor would have been more appropriate, for he regarded organized religion with the conventional contempt which can be learnt more easily from Ingersoll than from Voltaire. And this was, as it happened, the not very important side of his character which he turned toward the mission station and the groups in front of the veranda. Something in their shameless repose and indifference inflamed his own fury of efficiency, and as he could get no particular answer to his first questions, he began to do all the talking himself. Standing out there in the strong sunshine, a spick-and-span figure in his Panama hat and neat clothes, his gripsack held in a steely grip, he began to shout at the people in the shadow. He began to explain to them very loudly why they were lazy and filthy and bestially ignorant and lower than the beasts that perish, in case this problem should have previously exercised their minds. In his opinion, it was the deleterious influence of priests that had made them so miserably poor and so hopelessly oppressed that they were able to sit in the shade and smoke and do nothing. "And a mighty soft crowd you must be at that," he said, "to be bullied by these stuck-up josses because they walk about in their mitres and their tiaras and their gold copes and other glad rags, looking down on everybody else like dirt, being bamboozled by crowns and canopies and sacred umbrellas like a kid at a pantomime, just because a pompous old high priest of mumbo-jumbo looks as if he was the Lord of the earth. What about you? What do you look like, you poor simps? I tell you, that's why you're way back in barbarism and can't read or write and—" At this point, the high priest of Mumbo Jumbo came in an undignified hurry out of the door of the mission house, not looking very like a lord of the earth, but rather like a bundle of black second-hand clothes buttoned round a short bolster in the semblance of a guy. He was not wearing his tiara, supposing him to possess one, but a shabby broad hat not very dissimilar from those of the Spanish Indians, and it was thrust to the back of his head with a gesture of botheration. He seemed just about to speak to the motionless natives when he caught sight of the stranger and said quickly, "Oh, can I be of any assistance? Would you like to come inside?" Mr. Paul Snaith came inside, and it was the beginning of a considerable increase of that journalist's information on many things. Presumably, his journalistic instinct was stronger than his prejudices, as indeed it often is in clever journalists, and he asked a good many questions, the answers to which interested and surprised him. He discovered that the Indians could read and write, for the simple reason that the priest had taught them, but that they did not read or write any more than they could help from a natural preference for more direct communications. He learned that these strange people who sat about in heaps on their veranda without stirring a hair could work quite hard on their own patches of land, especially those of them who were more than half Spanish, and he learned with still more astonishment that they all had patches of land that were really their own. That much was part of a stubborn tradition that seemed quite native to natives, but in that also the priest had played a certain part, and by doing so had taken perhaps what was his first and last part in politics, if it was only local politics. There had recently swept through that region one of those fevers of atheist and almost anarchist radicalism, which break out periodically in countries of the Latin culture, generally beginning in a secret society and generally ending in a civil war and in very little else. The local leader of the iconoclastic party was a certain Alvarez, a rather picturesque adventurer of Portuguese nationality, but, as his enemies said, of partly Negro origin, the head of any number of lodges and temples of initiation of the sort that in such places clothe even atheism with something mystical. The leader on the more conservative side was a much more commonplace person, a very wealthy man named Mendoza, the owner of many factories and quite respectable, but not very exciting. It was the general opinion that the cause of law and order would have been entirely lost if it had not adopted a more popular policy of its own, in the form of securing land for the peasants, and this movement had mainly originated from the little mission station of Father Brown. While he was talking to the journalist, Mendoza, the conservative leader, came in. He was a stout, dark man with a bald head like a pear and a round body, also like a pear. He was smoking a very fragrant cigar, but he threw it away, perhaps a little theatrically, when he came into the presence of the priest, as if he had been entering church, and bowed with a curve that in so corpulent a gentleman seemed quite improbable. He was always exceedingly serious in his social gestures, especially towards religious institutions. He was one of those laymen who are much more ecclesiastical than ecclesiastics. It embarrassed Father Brown a good deal, especially when carried thus into private life. "I think I am an anti-clerical," Father Brown would say with a faint smile, "but there wouldn't be half so much clericism if they would only leave things to the clerics." "Why, Mr. Mendoza," exclaimed the journalist with a new animation, "I think we have met before. Weren't you at the Trade Congress in Mexico last year?" The heavy eyelids of Mr. Mendoza showed a flutter of recognition, and he smiled in his slow way. "I remember." "Pretty big business done there in an hour or two," said Snaith with relish. "Made a good deal of difference to you, too, I guess." "I have been very fortunate," said Mendoza modestly. "Don't you believe it," cried the enthusiastic Snaith. "Good fortune comes to the people who know when to catch hold, and you caught hold good and sure. But I hope I'm not interrupting your business." "Not at all," said the other. "I often have the honor of calling on the Padre for a little talk, merely for a little talk." It seemed as if this familiarity between Father Brown and a successful and even famous man of business completed the reconciliation between the priest and the practical Mr. Snaith. He felt, it might be supposed, a new respectability clothed the station and the mission, and was ready to overlook such occasional reminders of the existence of religion as a chapel and a presbytery can seldom wholly avoid. He became quite enthusiastic about the priest's program, at least on its secular and social side, and announced himself ready at any moment to act in the capacity of a live wire for its communication to the world at large. And it was at this point that Father Brown began to find the journalist rather more troublesome in his sympathy than in his hostility. Mr. Paul Snaith set out vigorously to feature Father Brown. He sent long and loud eulogies on him across the continent to his newspaper in the Middle West. He took snapshots of the unfortunate cleric in the most commonplace occupations and exhibited them in gigantic photographs in the gigantic Sunday papers of the United States. He turned his sayings into slogans and was continually presenting the world with a message from the reverend gentleman in South America. Any stock less strong and strenuously receptive than the American race would have become very much bored with Father Brown. As it was, he received handsome and eager offers to go on a lecturing tour in the States, and when he declined, the terms were raised with expressions of respectful wonder. A series of stories about him, like the stories of Sherlock Holmes, were, by the instrumentality of Mr. Snaith, planned out and put before the hero with requests for his assistance and encouragement. As the priest found they had started, he could offer no suggestion except that they should stop. And this in turn was taken by Mr. Snaith as the text for a discussion on whether Father Brown should disappear temporarily over a cliff in the manner of Dr. Watson's hero. To all these demands, the priest had patiently to reply in writing, saying that he would consent on such terms to the temporary cessation of the stories and begging that a considerable interval might occur before they began again. The notes he wrote grew shorter and shorter, and as he wrote the last of them, he sighed. Needless to say, this strange boom in the north reacted on the little outpost in the south where he had expected to live in so lonely an exile. The considerable English and American population already on the spot began to be proud of possessing so widely advertised a person. American tourists of the sort who land with a loud demand for Westminster Abbey landed on that distant coast with a loud demand for Father Brown. They were within measurable distance of running excursion trains named after him and bringing crowds to see him as if he were a public monument. He was especially troubled by the active and ambitious new traders and shopkeepers of the place, who were perpetually pestering him to try their wares and to give them testimonials. Even if the testimonials were not forthcoming, they would prolong the correspondence for the purpose of collecting autographs. As he was a good-natured person, they got a good deal of what they wanted out of him, and it was in answer to a particular request from a Frankfurt wine merchant named Eckstein that he wrote hastily a few words on a card which were to prove a terrible turning point in his life. Eckstein was a fussy little man with fuzzy hair and pince-nez who was wildly anxious that the priest should not only try some of his celebrated medicinal port, but should let him know where and when he would drink it, in acknowledging its receipt. The priest was not particularly surprised at the request, for he was long past surprised at the lunacies of advertisement. So he scribbled something down and turned to other business which seemed a little more sensible. He was again interrupted by a note from no less a person than his political enemy, Alvarez, asking him to come to a conference at which it was hoped that a compromise on an outstanding question might be reached, and suggesting an appointment that evening at a cafe just outside the walls of the little town. To this also he sent a message of acceptance by the rather florid and military messenger who was waiting for it, and then, having an hour or two before him, sat down to attempt to get through a little of his own legitimate business. At the end of the time, he poured himself out a glass of Mr. Eckstein's remarkable wine and, glancing at the clock with a humorous expression, drank it and went out into the night. Strong moonlight lay on the little Spanish town, so that when he came to the picturesque gateway, with its rather rococo arch and the fantastic fringe of palms beyond it, it looked rather like a scene in a Spanish opera. One long leaf of palm with jagged edges, black against the moon, hung down on the other side of the arch, visible through the archway, and had something of the look of the jaw of a black crocodile. The fancy would not have lingered in his imagination but for something else that caught his naturally alert eye. The air was deathly still, and there was not a stir of wind, but he distinctly saw the pendant palm leaf move. He looked around him and realized that he was alone. He had left behind the last houses, which were mostly closed and shuttered, and was walking between two long blank walls built of large and shapeless but flattened stones, tufted here and there with the queer prickly weeds of that region, walls which ran parallel all the way to the gateway. He could not see the lights of the cafe outside the gate. Probably it was too far away. Nothing could be seen under the arch but a wider expanse of large flagged pavement, pale in the moon, with the straggling prickly pear here and there. He had a strong sense of the smell of evil. He felt queer physical oppression, but he did not think of stopping. His courage, which was considerable, was perhaps even less strong a part of him than his curiosity. All his life he had been led by an intellectual hunger for the truth, even of trifles. He often controlled it in the name of proportion, but it was always there. He walked straight through the gateway, and on the other side a man sprang like a monkey out of the treetop and struck at him with a knife. At the same moment, another man came crawling swiftly along the wall, and whirling a cudgel round his head, brought it down. Father Brown turned, staggered, and sank in a heap. But as he sank, there dawned on his round face an expression of mild and immense surprise. There was living in the same little town at this time another young American, particularly different from Mr. Paul Snaith. His name was John Adams Race, and he was an electrical engineer, employed by Mendoza to fit out the old town with all the new conveniences. He was a figure far less familiar in satire and international gossip than that of the American journalist. Yet, as a matter of fact, America contains 1,000,000 men of the moral type of Race to one of the moral type of Snaith. He was exceptional in being exceptionally good at his job, but in every other way he was very simple. He had begun life as a druggist's assistant in a western village and risen by sheer work and merit. But he still regarded his hometown as the natural heart of the habitable world. He had been taught a very Puritan or purely evangelical sort of Christianity from the family Bible at his mother's knee, and insofar as he had time to have any religion, that was still his religion. Amid all the dazzling lights of the latest and even wildest discoveries, when he was at the very edge and extreme of experiment, working miracles of light and sound like a god, creating new stars and solar systems, he never for a moment doubted that the things back home were the best things in the world. His mother and the family Bible and the quiet and quaint morality of his village. He had as serious and noble a sense of the sacredness of his mother as if he had been a frivolous Frenchman. He was quite sure the Bible religion was really the right thing, only he vaguely missed it wherever he went into the modern world. He could hardly be expected to sympathize with the religious externals of Catholic countries, and in a dislike of miters and croziers, he sympathized with Mr. Snaith, though not in so cocksure a fashion. He had no liking for the public bowings and scrapings of Mendoza, and certainly no temptation to the Masonic mysticism of the atheist Alvarez. Perhaps all that semi-tropical life was too colored for him, shot with Indian red and Spanish gold. Anyhow, when he said there was nothing to touch his hometown, he was not boasting. He really meant that there was somewhere something plain and unpretentious and touching, which he really respected more than anything else in the world. Such being the mental attitude of John Adams' race in a South American station, there had been growing on him for some time a curious feeling which contradicted all his prejudices and for which he could not account. For the truth was this, that the only thing he had ever met in his travels that in the least reminded him of the old woodpile and the provincial properties and the Bible on his mother's knee was, for some inscrutable reason, the round face and black, clumsy umbrella of Father Brown. He found himself insensibly watching that commonplace and even comic black figure as it went bustling about, watching it with an almost morbid fascination, as if it were a walking riddle or contradiction. He had found something he could not help liking in the heart of everything he hated. It was as if he had been horribly tormented by lesser demons and then found that the devil was quite an ordinary person. Thus it happened that, looking out of his window on that moonlit night, he saw the devil go by, the demon of unaccountable blamelessness, in his broad black hat and long black coat, shuffling along the street towards the gateway, and saw it with an interest which he could not himself understand. He wondered where the priest was going, and what he was really up to, and remained gazing out into the moonlit street long after the little black figure had passed, and then he saw something else that intrigued him further. Two other men whom he recognized passed across his window as across a lighted stage. A sort of blue limelight of the moon ran in a spectral halo round the big bush of hair that stood erect on the head of little Eckstein, the wine cellar, and it outlined a taller and darker figure with an eagle profile and a queer, old-fashioned, and very top-heavy black hat, which seemed to make the whole outline still more bizarre, like a shape in a shadow pantomime. Race rebuked himself for allowing the moon to play such tricks with his fancy, for on a second glance he recognized the black Spanish side whiskers and high-featured face of Dr. Calderon, a worthy medical man of the town, whom he had once found attending professionally on Mendoza. Still, there was something in the way the men were whispering to each other and peering up the street that struck him as peculiar. On a sudden impulse, he leapt over the low windowsill and himself went bareheaded up the road, following their trail. He saw them disappear under the dark archway, and a moment after there came a dreadful cry from beyond, curiously loud and piercing, and all the more blood-curdling to Race because it said something very distinctly in some tongue that he did not know. The next moment there was a rushing of feet, more cries, and then a confused roar of rage or grief that shook the turrets and tall palm trees of the place. There was a movement in the mob that had gathered as if they were sweeping backwards through the gateway, and then the dark archway resounded with a new voice, this time intelligible to him and falling with the note of doom as someone shouted through the gateway, "Father Brown is dead!" He never knew what prop gave way in his mind, or why something on which he had been counting suddenly failed him, but he ran towards the gateway and was just in time to meet his countryman, the journalist Snaith, coming out of the dark entrance, deadly pale and snapping his fingers nervously. "It's quite true," said Snaith, with something which for him approached to reverence. "He's a goner. The doctor's been looking at him, and there's no hope. Some of these damned Dagos clubbed him as he came through the gate. God knows why. It'll be a great loss to the place." Race did not, or perhaps could not reply, but ran on under the arch to the scene beyond. The small black figure lay where it had fallen on the wilderness of wide stones starred here and there with green thorn, and the great crowd was being kept back, chiefly by the mere gestures of one gigantic figure in the foreground. For there were many there who swayed hither and thither at the mere movement of his hand, as if he had been a magician. Alvarez, the dictator and demagogue, was a tall, swaggering figure, always rather flamboyantly clad, and on this occasion he wore a green uniform with embroideries like silver snakes crawling all over it, with an order round his neck hung on a very vivid maroon ribbon. His close curling hair was already gray, and, in contrast, his complexion, which his friends called olive and his foes octoroon, looked almost literally golden, as if it were a mask molded in gold. But his large-featured face, which was powerful and humorous, was at this moment properly grave and grim. He had been waiting, he explained, for Father Brown at the cafe when he had heard a rustle and a fall and, coming out, had found the corpse lying on the flagstones. "I know what some of you are thinking," he said, looking round proudly, "and if you are afraid of me, as you are, I will say it for you. I am an atheist. I have no God to call on for those who will not take my word. But I tell you, in the name of every root of honor that may be left to a soldier and a man, that I had no part in this. If I had the men here that did it, I would rejoice to hang them on that tree." "Naturally, we are glad to hear you say so," said old Mendoza stiffly and solemnly, standing by the body of his fallen coadjutor. "This blow has been too appalling for us to say what else we feel at present. I suggest that it will be more decent and proper if we remove my friend's body and break up this irregular meeting. I understand," he added gravely to the doctor, "that there is unfortunately no doubt." "There is no doubt," said Dr. Calderon. John Race went back to his lodgings sad and with a singular sense of emptiness. It seemed impossible that he should miss a man whom he never knew. He learned that the funeral was to take place next day, for all felt that the crisis should be passed as quickly as possible for fear of riots that were hourly growing more probable. When Snaith had seen the row of Red Indians sitting on the veranda, they might have been a row of ancient Aztec images carved in red wood. But he had not seen them as they were when they heard that the priest was dead. Indeed, they would certainly have risen in revolution and lynched the Republican leader if they had not been immediately blocked by the direct necessity of behaving respectfully to the coffin of their own religious leader. The actual assassins, whom it would have been most natural to lynch, seemed to have vanished into thin air. Nobody knew their names, and nobody would ever know whether the dying man had even seen their faces. That strange look of surprise that was apparently his last look on earth might have been the recognition of their faces. Alvarez repeated violently that it was no work of his, and attended the funeral, walking behind the coffin in his splendid silver and green uniform with a sort of bravado of reverence. Behind the veranda, a flight of stone steps scaled a very steep green bank, fenced by a cactus hedge, and up this the coffin was laboriously lifted to the ground above and placed temporarily at the foot of the great gaunt crucifix that dominated the road and guarded the consecrated ground. Below in the road were great seas of people lamenting and telling their beads, an orphan population that had lost a father. Despite all these symbols that were provocative enough to him, Alvarez behaved with restraint and respect, and all would have gone well, as Race told himself, had the others only let him alone. Race told himself bitterly that old Mendoza had always looked like an old fool, and had now very conspicuously and completely behaved like an old fool. By a custom common in simpler societies, the coffin was left open and the face uncovered, bringing the pathos to the point of agony for all those simple people. This, being consonant to tradition, need have done no harm, but some officious person had added to it the custom of the French freethinkers of having speeches by the graveside. Mendoza proceeded to make a speech, a rather long speech, and the longer it was, the longer and lower sank John Race's spirits and sympathies with the religious ritual involved. A list of saintly attributes, apparently of the most antiquated sort, was rolled out with the dilatory dullness of an after-dinner speaker who does not know how to sit down. That was bad enough, but Mendoza also had the ineffable stupidity to start reproaching and even taunting his political opponents. In 3 minutes he had succeeded in making a scene, and a very extraordinary scene it was. "We may well ask," he said, looking around him pompously, "we may well ask where such virtues can be found among those who have madly abandoned the creed of their fathers. It is when we have atheists among us, atheist leaders, nay, sometimes even atheist rulers, that we find their infamous philosophy bearing fruit in crimes like this. If we ask who murdered this holy man, we shall assuredly find." Africa of the forests looked out of the eyes of Alvarez, the hybrid adventurer, and Race fancied he could see suddenly that the man was after all a barbarian who could not control himself to the end. One might guess that all his illuminated transcendentalism had a touch of voodoo. Anyhow, Mendoza could not continue, for Alvarez had sprung up and was shouting back at him and shouting him down with infinitely superior lungs. "Who murdered him?" he roared. "Your God murdered him. His own God murdered him. According to you, he murders all his faithful and foolish servants, as he murdered that one." And he made a violent gesture, not towards the coffin, but the crucifix. Seeming to control himself a little, he went on in a tone still angry but more argumentative. "I don't believe it, but you do. Isn't it better to have no God than one that robs you in this fashion? I, at least, am not afraid to say that there is none. There is no power in all this blind and brainless universe that can hear your prayer or return your friend. Though you beg heaven to raise him, he will not rise. Though I dare heaven to raise him, he will not rise. Here and now I will put it to the test. I defy the God who is not there to waken the man who sleeps forever." There was a shock of silence, and the demagogue had made his sensation. "We might have known," cried Mendoza in a thick, gobbling voice, "when we allowed such men as you—" A new voice cut into his speech, a high and shrill voice with a Yankee accent. "Stop! Stop!" cried Snaith the journalist. "Something's up! I swear, I saw him move!" He went racing up the steps and rushed to the coffin, while the mob below swayed with indescribable frenzies. The next moment he had turned a face of amazement over his shoulder and made a signal with his finger to Dr. Calderon, who hastened forward to confer with him. When the two men stepped away from the coffin, all could see that the position of the head had altered. A roar of excitement rose from the crowd and seemed to stop suddenly, as if cut off in midair, for the priest in the coffin gave a groan and raised himself on one elbow, looking with bleared and blinking eyes at the crowd. John Race Adams, who had hitherto known only miracles of science, never found himself able in after years to describe the topsy-turvydom of the next few days. He seemed to have burst out of the world of time and space and to be living in the impossible. In half an hour, the whole of that town and district had been transformed into something never known for 1,000 years. A medieval people turned into a mob of monks by a staggering miracle. A Greek city where the god had descended among men. Thousands prostrated themselves in the road. Hundreds took vows on the spot, and even the outsiders, like the two Americans, were able to think and speak of nothing but the prodigy. Alvarez himself was shaken, as well he might be, and sat down with his head upon his hands. And in the midst of all this tornado of beatitude was a little man struggling to be heard. His voice was small and faint, and the noise was deafening. He made weak little gestures that seemed more those of irritation than anything else. He came to the edge of the parapet above the crowd, waving it to be quiet, with movements rather like the flap of the short wings of a penguin. There was something a little more like a lull in the noise, and then Father Brown for the first time reached the utmost stretch of the indignation that he could launch against his children. "Oh, you silly people," he said in a high and quavering voice. "Oh, you silly, silly people." Then he suddenly seemed to pull himself together, made a bolt for the steps with his more normal gait, and began hurriedly to descend. "Where are you going, Father?" said Mendoza, with more than his usual veneration. "To the telegraph office," said Father Brown hastily. "What? No, of course, it's not a miracle. Why should there be a miracle? Miracles are not so cheap as all that." And he came tumbling down the steps, the people flinging themselves before him to implore his blessing. bless you," said Father Brown hastily. "God bless you all and give you more sense." And he scuttled away with extraordinary rapidity to the telegraph office, where he wired to his bishop's secretary. "There is some mad story about a miracle here. Hope his lordship not give authority. Nothing in it." As he turned away from his effort, he tottered a little with the reaction, and John Race caught him by the arm. "Let me see you home," he said. "You deserve more than these people are giving you." John Race and the priest were seated in the presbytery. The table was still piled up with the papers with which the latter had been wrestling the day before. The bottle of wine and the emptied wine-glass still stood where he had left them. "And now," said Father Brown almost grimly, "I can begin to think." "I shouldn't think too hard just yet," said the American. "You must be wanting a rest. Besides, what are you going to think about?" I have pretty often had the task of investigating murders, as it happens, said Father Brown. Now I have got to investigate my own murder. If I were you, said Race, I should take a little wine first. Father Brown stood up and filled himself another glass, lifted it, looked thoughtfully into the vacancy, and put it down again. Then he sat down once more and said, "Do you know what I felt like when I died? You may not believe it, but my feeling was one of overwhelming astonishment." "Well," answered Race, "I suppose you were astonished at being knocked on the head." Father Brown leaned over to him and said in a low voice, "I was astonished at not being knocked on the head." Race looked at him for a moment as if he thought the knock on the head had been only too effective, but he only said, "What do you mean?" "I mean that when that man brought his bludgeon down with a great swipe, it stopped at my head and did not even touch it. In the same way, the other fellow made as if to strike me with a knife, but he never gave me a scratch. It was just like play acting. I think it was. But then followed the extraordinary thing." He looked thoughtfully at the papers on the table for a moment and then went on. "Though I had not even been touched with knife or stick, I began to feel my legs doubling up under me and my very life failing. I knew I was being struck down by something, but it was not by those weapons. Do you know what I think it was?" And he pointed to the wine on the table. Race picked up the wine glass and looked at it and smelt it. "I think you were right," he said. "I began as a druggist and studied chemistry. I couldn't say for certain without an analysis, but I think there's something very unusual in this stuff. There are drugs by which the Asiatics produce a temporary sleep that looks like death." "Quite so," said the priest calmly. "The whole of this miracle was faked for some reason or other. That funeral scene was staged and timed. I think it is part of that raving madness of publicity that has got hold of Snaith. But I can hardly believe he would go quite so far merely for that. After all, it's one thing to make copy out of me and run me as a sort of sham Sherlock Holmes, and—" Even as the priest spoke, his face altered. His blinking eyelids shut suddenly, and he stood up as if he were choking. Then he put one wavering hand, as if groping his way, towards the door. "Where are you going?" asked the other in some wonder. "If you ask me," said Father Brown, who was quite white, "I was going to pray, or rather, to praise." "I'm not sure I understand. What is the matter with you?" "I was going to praise God for having so strangely and so incredibly saved me by an inch." "Of course," said Race, "I am not of your religion, but believe me, I have religion enough to understand that. Of course, you would thank God for saving you from death." "No," said the priest, "not from death, from disgrace." The other sat staring, and the priest's next words broke out of him with a sort of cry. "And if it had only been my disgrace, but it was the disgrace of all I stand for, the disgrace of the faith that they went about to encompass. What it might have been, the most huge and horrible scandal ever launched against us since the last lie was choked in the throat of Titus Oates." "What on earth are you talking about?" demanded his companion. "Well, I'd better tell you at once," said the priest, and sitting down, he went on more composedly. "It came to me in a flash when I happened to mention Snaith and Sherlock Holmes. Now, I happen to remember what I wrote about his absurd scheme. It was the natural thing to write, and yet I think they had ingeniously maneuvered me into writing just those words. They were something like, 'I am ready to die and come to life again like Sherlock Holmes, if that is the best way.' And the moment I thought of that, I realized that I had been made to write all sorts of things of that kind, all pointing to the same idea. I wrote as if to an accomplice, saying that I would drink the drugged wine at a particular time. Now, don't you see?" Race sprang to his feet, still staring. "Yes," he said, "I think I begin to see. They would have boomed the miracle. Then they would have bust up the miracle. And what is worst, they would have proved that I was in the conspiracy. It would have been our sham miracle. That's all there is to it, and about as near hell as you and I will ever be, I hope." Then he said, after a pause, in quite a mild voice, "They certainly would have got quite a lot of good copy out of me." Race looked at the table and said darkly, "How many of these brutes were in it?" Father Brown shook his head. "More than I like to think of," he said, "but I hope some of them were only tools. Alvarez might think that all's fair in war, perhaps. He has a queer mind. I'm very much afraid that Mendoza is an old hypocrite. I never trusted him, and he hated my action in an industrial matter. But all that will wait. I have only got to thank God for the escape, and especially that I wired at once to the bishop." John Race appeared to be very thoughtful. "You've told me a lot I didn't know," he said at last, "and I feel inclined to tell you the only thing you don't know. I can imagine how those fellows calculated well enough. They thought any man alive waking up in a coffin to find himself canonized like a saint and made into a walking miracle for everyone to admire would be swept along with his worshippers and accept the crown of glory that fell on him out the sky. And I reckon their calculation was pretty practical psychology as men go. I've seen all sorts of men in all sorts of places, and I tell you frankly, I don't believe there's one man in 1,000 who could wake up like that with all his wits about him, and while he was still almost talking in his sleep, would have the sanity and the simplicity and the humility to—" He was much surprised to find himself moved and his level voice wavering. Father Brown was gazing abstractedly and in a rather cockeyed fashion at the bottle on the table. "Look here," he said, "what about a bottle of real wine?"